What is going on, everyone? Deej is here with the second episode of In the Weeds with Deej, where we examine some of the more common things in Advanced Wars competitive play. However, we break it down, we look at all the stuff holistically, and we really hammer home what you need to do. As a lot of you mentioned in the last video, the move planner and the infantry rolls really helped your gameplay, so I've decided to create a second one. This time we're going to examine the ubiquitous term front switching. Now, people might hear this term and have a vague idea of what front switching is, but in this video we're going to talk about everything about front switching, and we're going to make you experts on front switching. In fact, I enlisted the help of an Advanced Wars Fog expert to help teach this video, Tordread.
Hey, it's Tordread here.
Class is now in session. So, first things first, what is front switching? Front switching means switching your units from your strong side in Advanced Wars in a fog map. We're talking about fog. It's from your strong side to your weak side or your neutral side. Typically there's three fronts. Maybe you have a strong side, weak side, center is neutral or something like that. But you go from your strong side to a different front. It's not viable in Standard because in Standard your opponent sees all of your moves, they can react accordingly. But in Fog, you have the ability to deny your opponent vision of what's really going on behind the scenes. That's why front switching is so key in Fog. You can really catch your opponent off guard. So, front switching in Fog is a tactic that can be game changing. I like catchphrases and simple rules to follow. Like when you see three tanks on the same front, build a medium tank, simple stuff like that. So my simple take for front switching is, you see your opponent's artillery, time to front switch away from that front. Remember, see your opponent's artillery, maybe it goes in the forest, it's defending, just switch to the other front. Because that artillery is not as mobile as tanks, copters, etc., recons, and it also cannot move and shoot at the same turn. So let's say your tank leaves and attacks another tank somewhere else, your artillery can't really retaliate. It's just gotta, slowly move along with its 5 movement instead of tank 6 movement or copter 6 movement. So when you see an artillery, in general, you want to switch fronts, unless that artillery, of course, is open and your opponent leaves a way to get in and smash it. Usually you can take that hit, but however, if it is covered by, say, infantry and tanks and whatnot, and you're not going to be able to reach it, or if you do reach it, you're going to get punished, just switch fronts. So like I said before, this is a class. So I have your first question, and there's multiple answers for this question. The question I pose to you all is, what do you need for a successful front switch? And there are 5 key components to a successful front switch. You get a point for every one you get correct. So if you only get 2 of the 5, you get 2 points, etc. So I'll give you a second to pause, and what do you think makes a successful front switch? So the answer is, number 1, for me personally, I love minimal enemy detection. You want to do this behind the scenes so your opponent can't see you front switching, so they're caught off guard. So that you can capture all their properties and do a lot of damage without them knowing. So minimal enemy detection is one of them. Number 2, you want to use proper units to arrive, ideally faster units, tanks, recons, copters. You want to use fast units for front switching as well. You can use artillery, but they typically take more time. Like I said earlier, they can't move and shoot. So typically when a front switch, you want to use your tanks and stuff. Your artillery can stay in its spot and guard your weak side. So you want to have fast units going. Number 3, you want to switch to a front where you can gain something. You don't just front switch to blast some tanks. You switch fronts so you can capture some properties, some bases, some airports. You can smash tanks all you want, but you want to have an end goal in mind. You want to get that sweet income lead, and then you want to chill. So you want to be able to, take something from that exchange, not just front switching for the sake of it and having fun and swinging back and forth. No. So number 3, you want to make sure you actually gain something. Number 4, this is a big one, some of you guys forget, disengagement from the first front you're on. If you keep fighting on that front, you keep fighting over here, you just split your forces thin, and they're all going to get smashed. The ones that are still fighting are going to get smashed because it's their full forces versus half your forces, or whatever little amount you've cobbled left there. Like, disengage. Pull back is like a fulcrum. You pull back and you push forward. Like, it's very balanced, you want to do that. So make sure you disengage from the front that you were just on. That should also be a key to your opponent who is in the receiving end of the front switch. If they pull back, they're probably going to press somewhere else. So keep that in mind. Number 5, don't overextend. Cardinal sin alert, don't overextend. Even if you're front switching, doesn't mean you can just say, oh, I can overextend, it's a great deal. it's within the base and airport, but whatever, it's a front switch. No. Don't overextend. Don't overextend. Anyway, let's look at some examples of this. Tordread's going to help us out at this point, talk us through his thought process when he front switches. He's a great front switcher, as we all know. One of the best players in Fog. Let's get into it. So for our first example here, I figured I'd show a game in the global leagues on Hidden Edge. I've showed a game on this in the past in one of my replays. So this map right here, as you can see, we have, it's mid-game. It's around turn 12. Popular Modernism's turn. He's the green player against Zook000, who is the black hole player, and both pretty even on income and pretty even on unit value. So here is an inflection point in the game where you can use a front switch to your advantage. Now, spoiler alert, Popular Modernism does not correctly use a front switch, at least according to Tordread and I. And we want to break down how to do it better, what happens if you don't do it, etc. So in this instance, Popular Modernism is lucky and he has vision of an artillery. In a worst case situation, you don't know about that artillery until it shoots you. It's in the forest or you don't have vision on it, etc. But in this instance, green actually sees the artillery first. So in this instance, you should always just run away. At least get out of range. You don't have to run away completely, but at least get out of range of the artillery at minimum. So Tordread, break it down for us here. What do you think you would do in this situation in the current map state?
So, in this current map state, I would try to front switch most of my forces to the top side of the map as green. There's a few reasons to do that. One is you're seeing that artillery that's in the bottom by the black hole player, and you usually do not want to fight directly into artillery, especially if you can't break into it on the same turn. Second point is that green has pretty good center control right now. Most of their vehicles are positioned in the center and they can shift to either front pretty nicely. They also have 2 artillery in the top side, so those are not easily shifted down to the bottom side.
Good point.
So in this case, you kind of want to, not brawl into something in the bottom side, especially because there's no properties to gain. If he does end up winning a fight in the bottom, he's not going to get anything long term. If he shifts tanks to the top side of the map, he might be able to regain that property that black is currently taking top.
Yeah, and the center middle property as well. Yeah, as we said, like this comm tower over here, it's too close to the base to realistic takeover at this point. And theoretically, assuming you one-shot that tank and do get to the artillery, you are within 1 turn of the base. So, and Jess's power is coming up, like, in this situation, it just makes sense. You'll be overextending for the most part. There's artillery as well. This is just like the perfect storm for a good front shift.
Yep, exactly.
So, let's break it down what actually happens in the game. So, in this instance, green actually just goes right into it. Attacks into tanks, artillery. Doesn't actually get a hit off on the artillery. There's no tanks currently in range of the artillery, but just kind of, goes in half. I don't want to say half-asses it, but, doesn't with the full effort. Stays out of artillery range, but still puts a bunch of infantry that are probably going to die as a result of this. And black does punish this, so instead of taking the middle like he could with all these units over here, kind of just succumbs to the temptation of going over here and fighting into it, and then a medium tank comes in. We can speed forward this. There's a brawl. The medium tank gets in range of this artillery, gets hit by the artillery and the medium tank and dies. And a couple turns later, black just wins. Because easier to reinforce. There was an artillery here that still lived. Basically enabled a 2-shot on the medium tank, and black was able to maintain all properties at the top and middle as a result. Even though green had center control, which is crucial. We teach everyone you want to have a death ball in the center. You want to be able to have maneuverability, but green did not use that maneuverability to his advantage. He got kind of trapped into the thought that I have to attack into this over here. So, yeah, so Tordread, you said you would instead go in the middle, and you said you would actually fight top, or would you go in the middle? Do you have a personal preference?
Personally, on Hidden Edge, I like to try and destroy one of the top or bottom fronts while maintaining my own properties, so that you get that 2k income lead, because the center property is pretty hard to capture in my experience, and it can lead to a lot of overextensions. So if you just shift up all these tanks on this turn, just get them in range, then the turn where black sort of blocks off the space towards that property he's capturing would not happen, and he'd probably be able to take an artillery shot and even break that and probably take the property.
Yeah. Also, just like moving that medium tank, like he invested so much in this medium tank and the artillery, those two units are going to take longer to get to the fight if you shift all your forces up as green. But you have just so many more units in gameplay. You probably have like at least a 1.5 to 1 advantage in terms of fighting black at the top right there. So, missed opportunity, but you live and you learn. Also, it doesn't help that there's all these forts that kind of enable walling for artillery, so it's really hard to reach them in the first place. Question number 2. Why aren't indirects, namely artillery, rockets, missiles, why aren't they as good in fog as they are in standard? You can pause the video and take a little bit if you want. Alright, well the answer, we're going to go into it, so just stay tuned. Alright, so this is example number 2. This actually features Tordread himself on the map Birds of a Wire. I've heard some of you talking about this map. It's currently in the Global League. It's facing off against this Chinese player. You can't see his name, it just says question marks because the Advanced Wars by Web Replay Viewer does not interpret Chinese characters. But anyway, so this map we want to show an example, but before we get into it, I want to talk about artillery briefly in fog. You see, artillery, intuitively you think artillery are better in fog because they can hide in forests and get some shots off. However, in actuality, artillery are not as good in fog as they are in standard play. That's for a couple reasons. Number one, actually using artillery, they're not as good at zoning. Your opponent doesn't usually know where they are, so if you're trying to zone out units, it's not as effective. The most important thing, though, is in terms of front switching, which we're covering, artillery are not as good at front switching and covering ground as tanks are. For example, if you have an artillery and your opponent moves across the map, your artillery has to move 5 spaces instead of 6 of a tank, and it also cannot move and shoot the same turn as a tank. So if a tank gets out of its range and attacks something else, you cannot retaliate, which kind of leaves one vehicle behind in terms of counting the attacks by vehicles. Anyway, we'll show how, in this instance, Tordread actually builds an artillery early on in this game. Tordread, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so Birds on a Wire has some interesting artillery plays because of the forests that are 3 tiles away from many of the cities and the river blocks. So I built this artillery early as sort of like a bait, like maybe my opponent would interrupt this cap and then they wouldn't have anything else to counterattack onto the artillery because it's a 1 base side. But my opponent has shifted most of their vehicles all towards one side, so they actually have a pretty strong attack when I move my artillery into a vulnerable position. And it doesn't really go that well for me. I lose a pretty hefty lead when the tank hits my artillery, and I pretty much just get nothing in return, and I can't even cap the city immediately.
Yeah, so this is a very precarious position. Chinese player seems to be definitely ahead on his weak side due to the artillery. It could be argued, if it was a tank, you'd probably be better off, but it's devil's advocate. But yeah, when you're using artillery, you want to have it guarded. It goes without saying, but it's the cost of using artillery. But anyway, I think you did a great job in this game overcoming that deficit by using the front switch. So you go back, you hold on for a bit, and then you basically come back in the middle over here. You use your artillery again. I believe, your opponent backs off because of the artillery. But then your opponent builds both a rockets and a medium tank over here. You didn't even see any of these things, but you saw that he backed off. Could you talk about your thought process here?
So in this instance, I won a nice little skirmish on that left front with my tanks, and when I saw him back off and also moving up an artillery, an anti-air, and a recon on the other side, I figured that he probably had not too much on the right side, and I could shift over and sort of annihilate it. There's no tanks. There's just mostly like units that the tanks would do well into. So I can move back my artillery into a defensive position in that forest that covers that property, and then I can start to shift my tanks into a center position. So if there's an attack back onto the left front, I'm still in position to hit that. And if there isn't, and I don't see any real movement, I can use my Jake Super to push my tanks to the right side and completely obliterate his front.
That's basically what you did. You used your super, and then you basically shifted all your units over here to pick off all the units on the right side. Whereas all his strong units over here, the medium tank and rockets, were out of position. Just as we were talking earlier why artillery aren't as good in fog, rockets are just terrible in fog. I don't really find any scenario where I build a rockets in fog. Terrible movement. If your opponent gets vision of them, they're just going to move across the map. Tordread didn't even see them, but if he saw them, you can be damn sure that he would go across the map. They'd not even fight anywhere near the rockets, and the rockets would take forever to catch up because it has 5 movement, it has tires as well. So front switching is just a given versus rockets. Artillery, of course, you could fight into it if you think you have sufficient counterplay, you can break through. However, you see rockets, it's like, why even bother? But yeah, you're able to punish him over here, where he has a medium tank and rockets, which aren't very flexible in terms of the front switch. And Tordread had a great turn, and in turn, his opponent resigned because this is just a crushing defeat on this side over here. You can't really recover from that. Because how do you push up here? Like, infantry aren't in position to cap either, and this rockets is out of position as well. So I think that's a great example of how to properly front switch. I like how you also put it in the center first, and then waited for your super to do it instead. And I think you also did a good job in terms of vision denial. I don't think he had any idea.
There's no vision on any of this.
He only saw this one tank over here, probably assumed you're armed to the teeth over here. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, it's a crucial part of front switching, vision denial, making sure you're doing it behind the scenes. And he was completely caught off guard. This anti-air had no idea it was coming. It's artillery as well. And then, look, Tordread can capture this property. Like we said earlier, why would you fight in an area where you can't gain anything? Like, Tordread's not going to be able to gain anything near this HQ in this city over here because it's right next to the base. Meanwhile, over here, Tordread can, take advantage of this by capping that with this infantry, capping that with this infantry, and really get some nice counterplay and progress the game forward rather than just having meaningless battles. So I thought this is a really good example of a successful front switch. Do you have any comments? Do you think you would have done anything differently? Any other thoughts on this?
Well, my first thought was when I did front switch and I saw the tanks moving back, I sort of assumed artillery, because there are some really nice spots near the HQ. The forest right behind the HQ is usually a good artillery spot. So when you see tanks that are like moving 2 tiles within that, oftentimes you just want to stay out of range of those engagements unless you really want to go all in. So that was part of my thought process behind moving it. Another thing that I did in this scenario to try and keep a favorable front switch was I sacked this copter on the right side, so that the anti-air would sort of like still be interested, because I can stop a cap and I know it's going to die, but that sort of keeps him engaged on that front.
That's true, and not enough things to punish what kills the anti-air anyway. It's only a net 1,000 gain, and it stopped a cap, so it's probably worth it in the end.
Yep.
Good points, and yeah, I didn't even see the rockets, but assuming you see the rockets, it's just, don't build rockets. If you take a few things home, don't build rockets, and think twice about building artillery. Remember, if you see an artillery, you can just avoid it. You can go, this player could have done the same thing. They saw your artillery earlier, although, like I said, some situations when you see an artillery, of course, if you have counterplay and you can reach it, why not go for it? But in most situations, if you see an artillery, it's usually going to be defended pretty well with infantry walls at minimum. So make sure that you're flexible, that you have nice center control. That's why people always talk about deathballing in the center, so you have maximum maneuverability. If you see rockets, if you see artillery, if you see medium tanks on one side, just shift to the other side. In most situations, there's usually properties you can pick up and gain and get a nice crucial advantage to win the game. Review time! Why is front switching more of a thing in fog than in standard play? The reason is because in standard play, your opponent can see all of your moves. So if you front switch, they will just mirror your moves, and it's not really effective. I hope you all learned something, and now you feel much more comfortable with the concept of front switching. And now you can tally your scores and see how you did. And I hope to see you guys next time on the next Deej's video. Bye bye.